Hello everyone, I'm Rhiannon Branch with Brownfield here in beautiful central Illinois talking to Nick Tinsley with BASF. Nick, how's it going?
It's going great this morning.
Well, I guess start by introducing yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you do for BASF.
Sure, so Nick Tinsley, I am a seed treatment technical field representative with BASF, and so essentially what that involves is a lot of customer support as well as research on our seed treatment products.
Today we want to talk a little bit about soybean cyst nematode action month and kind of the importance of testing for that. So let's kick things off by talking about action month in general. What is it and why was it started?
Yeah, it's a good question. So SCN Action Month is really an awareness campaign, and so we've been partnering with the SCN coalition to help drive awareness around SCN. So we know that many growers probably underestimate the yield impact that it's having in their fields, and so this is a way for BASF to provide the information and tools that growers need to help manage SCN.
So when it comes to SCN, let's maybe do a deep dive into what it is and some of the impacts that it has.
Yeah, absolutely. So nematodes, generally speaking, are microscopic roundworms, so very difficult to see. And SCN lives below ground where it can infect the root systems. And so this is going to cause those nematodes to steal nutrients and resources from the plant, and that can cause some yield loss on its own. And in addition to that, those females eventually are going to turn into cysts with hundreds of eggs potentially inside of them. And so you can imagine that over the course of a growing season, you can have populations really skyrocket in any given year.
So with some of the testing and trials you guys have done, do you have any data or numbers you can share on some of the impacts, yield impacts that it's had so far?
Yeah, so every year it's estimated that soybean growers lose about 100 million bushels to SCN, which is quite a bit. To put that in dollars and cents terms, that's anywhere from $1 to $1.5 billion. So we know we're giving up a lot to SCN, and we know that there are things that we can do to help manage this pest better.
In comparison to maybe some other pests that we're used to seeing, can you kind of compare the impact there? Is this one of the ones that is more damaging, or kind of where does it fall on that scale?
Absolutely. It's the most damaging pathogen in soybeans that we face. In any given year, it usually causes more yield loss than the top 2 or 3 pathogens combined, and so it's a very serious pest of soybean.
We hear about sudden death syndrome kind of along with SCN. Do those factor in together at all?
Yeah, it is really important to consider managing SCN with other things as well. So that kind of is the pathogen that makes everything worse. And so as you can imagine, when it's feeding on those root systems, it's creating wounds, and that's going to allow for secondary infection by other pathogens like the one that causes SDS.
So when growers are out in their field, how can they determine if they have any SCN issues? What are maybe some of the first signs that they can keep an eye out for?
It's very difficult. So it's been estimated that we can lose about a third of our yield without seeing any symptoms whatsoever. And so this is really part of the problem. In extreme circumstances, it is possible to see things like stunted plants or yellowing chlorotic plants, but that's really in hot, dry conditions and almost usually on sandy soils. And so this is part of the challenge, is growers don't see the impact of what's going on below ground.
Testing is one of those ways that growers can be involved and kind of get ahead of this issue. So maybe talk to us a little bit about how that process works and what growers should keep in mind when they're testing.
Yeah, I think that testing is so important for growers to understand exactly what kind of populations they're dealing with. And it's not very complicated. Really, all you need is a standard 1-inch soil probe and a bucket. And if you don't have a soil probe, you can get by with a trowel. So typically what I'll recommend to a grower is to kind of wait until after harvest when the crop is off, and then maybe do a transect across the field, taking a number of samples, combining them in the bucket, and then taking a composite of that into a soil bag that you'd submit to a lab. That's really all it takes.
What's the best time of year to be doing that type of sampling?
We recommend doing that in the fall, and really the rationale behind that is that the crop is off, so it's very easy to get out and maneuver in that field. And also during the growing season, SCN is constantly going through new generations. So if you sampled in June, you might really underestimate the amount of SCN that field is producing. And so those are the two reasons to really do it in the fall.
So prioritizing the fall time period, can it be done throughout the year? Is that beneficial at all, or just once during the fall?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, you could do it kind of before planting, right? A lot of times we're busy with other tasks at that point. One of the other things growers can do is somewhere around 30 to 45 days after planting, they can dig up soybean plants and look at the root systems. And on those root systems, you might find cysts, and that can be a good way to kind of check how well your treatments are performing against SCN. But yeah, definitely want to sample for eggs outside of the growing season.
So when you're doing that testing, what are some of the results that you get from it, and the benefits of doing that?
Yeah, so essentially the way this works is that when you get a result back from the lab, it's going to report the number of eggs per 100 cubic centimeters of soil, and that's about a half a cup. And so essentially we've done thousands of these samples, and last year specifically, we saw SCN detected in 77% of the samples that were submitted. So, nearly 3/4 have SCN. On average, we found 2,882 eggs per 100 cubic centimeters of soil. And to put that in perspective, the threshold for this is really 500 eggs per 100 cubic centimeters. So we're talking about 6 times the threshold on average. And probably more importantly than that, half of the samples came back as being at or above threshold. So we really know that there's a lot of these nematodes out there, and that there are ways that we can be better protecting against yield loss.
So now that we've got the test results, what can we do with them? What are some of the management strategies that are out there, or things growers can consider to kind of combat these issues?
Yeah, I think there's really a 4-pronged approach. The first is to sample, and we've got that kind of covered and out of the way. The second is to rotate crops. SCN doesn't survive on corn, and so, getting away from soybean for a year or two, it can be a great way to reduce really high numbers. The next step would be to plant a resistant soybean variety, and we're fortunate to have resistance in most of our varieties that are available. And finally, considering a nematode protectant seed treatment like Olivo from BASF is a great way to add some additional protection and recoup some yield at the end of the year.
Talk to us a little more about Olivo, what it is and how it works.
Yeah, so it's a seed treatment that gets applied to the seed prior to planting, and really what happens is once that seedling germinates and starts to grow, that Olivo can be found in that seed zone right around that developing root system. And so it's going to have activity against all life stages of SCN, including eggs, juveniles, and adults, and really provide a nice healthy start to the growing season to help set that plant up for success later on.
You talked about growers paying attention to both SCN and SDS. Is Olivo something that kind of helps protect against both of those?
Yeah, it's really the leader in the marketplace in the sense that it provides protection not only against SCN, but also directly against the pathogen that causes sudden death as well. Olivo's been around for almost 10 years now, and that's kind of hard to believe because I was around for the launch of it. And so I kind of consider it one of these ones I've helped usher to the market. And really what we found is over all those years of testing, on average, we expect a yield response of about 4.5 bushels per acre. And so that's a significant return on investment for growers to protect against some pretty serious pathogens.
You talk about seed treatments, like Olivo. How does that work? How often do you need to apply that for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah, unfortunately it's not a one and done situation. So like I said, it's applied to the seed each spring, and so it's there to protect that crop during the current growing season. And so any time that a field comes back with numbers that are a threat from an SCN standpoint, it would be a time to use something like Olivo seed treatment.
Guys have any numbers on maybe the yield advantage when using something like Olivo?
Yeah, 4.5 bushels is our long-term average, and those numbers tend to grow with increased pest pressure. So when we have a really bad SDS year, those numbers can get quite significant. One of the interesting things about Olivo is it kind of helps protect against multiple environmental conditions. So nematodes are more severe when it's hot and dry. And typically SDS is worse when it's cool and wet. And so kind of, if I could predict what the weather is going to be like, I think I could probably retire today. But in absence of that, using Olivo is a great way to protect and hedge your bets there.
You mentioned, a heavy SCN year or SDS year. How has this season been, whether that be here in Illinois or maybe across the Midwest for both of those?
Yeah, it's a good question. Everybody always asks me, is it going to be an SDS here? And I say the answer is yes. This kind of depends on where you are. Here in East Central Illinois, we experienced a very dry May and June, and so the impact of soybean cyst nematode is probably greater than it has been in the past. And we did see some rains coming on at the beginning of July, and unfortunately those kind of fizzled out, and so we didn't see a lot of SDS, although we know it's out there. And so yeah, it'll be an interesting year to see what the yields come back.
Anything else you want to add about SCN Action Month, or the importance of testing here as the fall season approaches?
Yeah, I would add two things. So one, beyond a seed treatment, really starting with a good resistant variety is something excellent that growers can do. And so Zetavo brand soybean seed from BASF is proud to launch 11 new varieties for 2024, all of which contain resistance against SCN. And in addition to that, I always get asked, what do I do with these numbers once I get them back from the lab? And so very recently, the SCN Coalition has launched a new SCN Profit Checker Calculator, which is a really excellent tool. A grower can take the numbers that they get back from the lab and put it in there with some information about the soil type and the soil pH, and it will provide a yield loss estimate. So it's a really valuable tool that growers can take that next step and connect those dots between soybean cyst nematode numbers and yield. And so that's really great.
You mentioned that resource. Any other places that growers can go to learn more about SCN Action Month or Alivo, anything that we've talked about today?
Yeah, I would recommend that growers check with their local state soybean associations to find out what testing services are provided in their area. And they could also visit scnactionmonth.com or thescncoalition.com. And those are both great resources. And feel free to talk to your BASF representative. We'll be happy to point you in the right direction.
Very good. Nick, I appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
Rhiannon Branch for Brownfield.